Hello, everyone, and welcome to Wider Angle. I've been looking forward to this conversation with Karen Cheung for months now. Karen is a writer from Hong Kong and the author of The Impossible City, a Hong Kong memoir, a book that was on several the best books of the year's list recently. Hi, Karen. Welcome to Wider Angle.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's so great to speak with you today. Your book documents the period between 1997 and 2021. You call it that space when so much felt possible. It's part memoir, part social commentary. A lot of it, is blended together. But tell me from the start, how is Hong Kong an impossible city? Why is it a city that is always dying, or as you write, a place always on the verge of mutilation? What do you mean by that?
So I think impossible is sort of a loaded word. And at first, I sort of had my doubts about whether or not that was the title that I was going to go with. I think, as you mentioned in a quote just now, I really want the impossible to actually be set up as a contrast to what is possible in the city. And the idea really is that these odds are really against us, and so much has been stacked up that's not in our favor. And yet there are still a lot of these people that I grew up with, and spent the past 3 decades of my life with, and all of the things, I really want to pay tribute to the ways that they're trying to make the city a more habitable place. And that has to do with all aspects of it. Part of it, a huge part of it, is politically, but also in terms of, what it means to foster a connection with your own neighborhood, people who are doing very, very hyper localized activism. There are people who are, running spaces, independent spaces against, in this very capitalistic market, and people who are trying to speak up about mental health and so on in a space that, the culture doesn't necessarily encourage doing so until maybe recently. And so it is a place for me that, even though, as you've said, I've mentioned in the book, the narrative that's given to it is that it's always dying. What I mean by that is, before the handover, there were pieces that were written in international media and have continued to be written about Hong Kong since, about how, oh, when this happens, it's the end of Hong Kong. So for instance, it would be like, oh, when Hong Kong is part of China again, that will be the end of Hong Kong. Or when 2047, which was initially this deadline of 50 years unchanged, we were meant to be able to keep our systems, our freedoms. That was meant to be another point when, okay, maybe Hong Kong is quote unquote over. And when it became apparent that it wasn't going to take as long as 2047, it was going to be earlier, pieces started popping up again about how, okay, Hong Kong is dying, and it would point to developments in the political sphere, and the growing crackdown on freedoms. And that was something that was very much part of this sort of, if we still believe in the existence of a grand narrative, right? That was sort of the narrative of Hong Kong that was being perpetuated at the time. And I sort of want to resist against that a little. And what I mean by verge of mutilation is, when things change politically, it doesn't necessarily always manifest in the way you see the city geographically. And, when you go out onto the streets, bar times when there are protests happening, and obviously, the cityscape will be altered very dramatically at those points in time. But a lot of the times when there are more subtle changes taking place, you don't always notice it if you just, go out and get takeaway. And when I look at the changes in the city, it's not just the political ones, it's also the fact that, a lot of these old Hong Kong, for instance, signposts or restaurants are closing down. And, part of it also has to do with just the robust, quote unquote, robust, free market and lack of regulations. A lot of it has to do with that, the lack of rent control. Those are also changes that really actually change the appearance of the city itself. And I sort of look at those changes, from gentrification to the way that over tourism changes certain neighborhoods. And I want to look at how these changes are also very acutely felt. And a lot of the times, I know cities are always changing. People always have this complaint. I know it's quite common in places like New York City, where people will go down to, I don't know, East Village, or they'll say something like, oh, it doesn't look like it did back in the 90s when everything was still cool. And I'm not really speaking to that sort of nostalgia, but it's more to do with the fact that why are we so incapable of keeping things that are close to our heart? Why can we not help people who are very passionate about, for instance, just making food that they love? Why can't we help them continue to survive in the city? Why is a fabric market that's been around for many centuries, and not centuries, but many decades, and why are they unable to still find a place in the city? That's sort of the questions that I don't really have answers for, but I try to have an opening or an entry point into them, or raise some questions as far as I can in the span of, a 300 something page book, which really covers kind of too much ground, I think, sometimes. But yeah, that's, I think, the best I could do at that point.
You write in the book at one point, it is not Hong Kong that has died, but the imagination of the place we were promised in 97. And it made me think about that notion, even in other political contexts that I might be personally familiar with, both in terms of what feels or gets promised, like in case of some Western Balkans countries, like the European Union, the vision, and just the disappointment and the disillusionment when, for this reason or another, that promise does not materialize or does not become true. And often how that sense of disillusionment, disappointment can even translate into a sense of defeatism or apathy or collective cynicism in some ways as well. You say that when we read about Hong Kong, it can seem as though the place exists only when our protests make the headlines, that our lives are defined by nothing but our politics. Tell me more about this, please. Both in terms of the dreams of how you wished or your generation Hong Kong to be, but also about how it was written about elsewhere.
Yeah, I think part of that, what I think at the time was really anger, came from the fact that I was someone who was in my early 20s at the time, working as a reporter for an English language media, a local media company in Hong Kong. And when you write in English in a place that's majority Cantonese speaking, you tend to really English language journalism almost operate in a separate sphere, even if you're a local company, and you tend to really have your eye on what international reporting is saying about the place that you grew up with and are familiar with. And so a lot of international media organizations are headquartered in Hong Kong at the time. In Asia, a lot of their Asia bureaus are headquartered in Hong Kong. And so I would get to meet a lot of international correspondents who would be posed here for a set amount of time, and then they would write about Hong Kong, and then they would go. And it's not so much those people or the mechanism of international journalism that I feel a certain amount of either anger or later apathy about. I understand that this is how it works. You know, they're an American or British organization. These are the things that they find interesting. But I think a lot of that frustration was in 2014, we had these massive protests that happened. And, you know, the occupation movement at the time, when a lot of Hong Kong people, especially those in my generation, went out and camped out on the streets for 79 days, that was such an attractive media story for so many international media organizations. A lot of people flew over just to cover the protests. I really started working as a reporter in 2015, and the next major protests were in 2019. And as a reporter, in the years of working between 2015 and 2018, it was just such a struggle to see this waning interest in Hong Kong, because the changes that were happening at the time were much slower. They were no less insidious, but it just wasn't as attractive of a story to a lot of people covering. And I understand, again, that, you know, you have a specific number of staff. You can't always dedicate that much interest to a place that, you know, if there's not any dramatic news events happening, you can't have the resources to cover those things. But at the same time, it perpetuates this idea that, you know, the only things that are worth discussing in Hong Kong is when there's this almost like romanticization of these young people all coming out and, you know, fighting for democracy, which, or whatever, which is, you know, to a certain extent a narrative that, of course, a lot of Western democracies would really latch onto. And again, I understand the sentiment behind it. I just wanted to know what it would be like if there were more stories about other things that were happening in Hong Kong at the time. And when I had the opportunity to write the book, I feel like I was, again, really trying to cram in too much, but I was really, I wanted to write about these things that I thought were really important, based on just observing, you know, things that were happening around me, but also things that I was experiencing, but that I would never really see an equivalent amount of attention given to. And that includes things like, you know, why is it so difficult to get mental health care in Hong Kong? Or, you know, what does it look like when, you know, everyone around the world talks about how millennial generation are the generation of people who would never be able to afford apartments, right? But I wanted to really look deeper into what are the specifics of the mechanisms of this phenomenon occurring in Hong Kong, and why, you know, people have to move around all the time. They're 30 years old and they're still living with their parents, and not necessarily by choice. And these are, I think, no less important to understanding the factors that drive discontent, or it also illuminates different facets of what it's like to live in a city, but it doesn't always get airtime. And I just saw it as an opportunity to be able to do like maybe an 8,000 word essay about, okay, this is what it was like for me and my friends to live through this thing. And these are all the relevant socioeconomic background about this issue. And I felt very fortunate to have been able to be given the space to write about those things.
Mm. It says in the book's dedication, to my Hong Kong friends, wherever you are. Who are these Hong Kong friends, in the sense, are they also metaphorical friends of the city too, besides your real friends?
Yes, definitely. So when I had it in a book, I think it was, the first draft was something around February 2021. And I think in late 2021 was when I had to, you know, finalize all of those things. And I can't remember when I decided on that dedication, but it was around a time when a lot of my friends started leaving the city. There's also been people, not people I know necessarily very well, but people that I was in a university camp with, for instance, and I met when I was 18, and we, stayed in a dorm together for a weekend. One of those people are in jail now, and it's just, when I say wherever you are, I really am thinking about like knowing, for instance, there are people who wouldn't be able to come back to Hong Kong anymore, or there are people who are detained and they aren't part they aren't physically in Hong Kong in that sense. And so wherever you are was just really a nod to me saying, I know that the city is still in your hearts and it's extremely important to you, and it's why you can't be here almost. And I wanted to say to them that this is for you as well. And it's also, I guess, a nod to this a sense of mass migration that always comes after, massive political events, right? And at the time, the UK government started introducing visas that would allow Hong Kong people to be able to move to the UK on a special visa. And so people that I know all my life growing up, or that I've been friends with for over a decade, I would go over to the flats all the time, and we would just have dinner, because I'm not super close with my family, and a lot of these people to me have been family. And just knowing that they are leaving, or would have already left, that was something that was very heartbreaking for me. And so I think I wanted to have a gesture towards, the fact that we are living through another period of mass immigration, and that will drastically change, this quote unquote formation of a Hong Kong diaspora in the years to come. And so, yeah, so that dedication was sort of me trying to come to terms with all of those things.
And besides reactions to the book, I'm curious, now that it's been out in the world for several months, what conversations has the book either sparked or intensified? Because it was so fascinating for me to learn different contexts on various themes that you address. Starting sometime, at some point you say there was no even language to discuss white supremacy, for example, or
Right.
other themes around rampant capitalism or even classism. So now that you're looking a little bit in hindsight, what's happened with the themes or conversations that you maybe aimed or that sparked unintentionally?
I think it can be categorized into a couple of different ones. So first of all, the book is published in English. It is published by an American publisher. So friends of mine who were in Hong Kong who had to, wanted to get a copy of the book would either have to order online. And there were a couple of independent bookstores that were selling the book, but English books operate in this very different realm in Hong Kong, where, because majority of people read in Chinese, and so people would not necessarily be motivated to read a book in English unless it's like, for instance, like a theory book that has not been translated, or there was no other way of reading it in Chinese. And so I sort of did not really expect it to enter into this local conversation or discourse, just because of the fact that and as I try to highlight in a book, like, language really does, it almost feels like there's different worlds of languages operating in Hong Kong. And I think one of the things I was very pleasantly surprised by was the fact that it did end up getting a local readership. And I think that really has to do with one or two bookstores that I've known from my years. In the past, I published zines, and I ran a magazine when I was in my mid-20s, and I had relationships with these bookstores. And so when the book came out, they stocked the book and promoted it on social media, and that was how a lot of people actually ended up finding out about it. And those conversations that people were having were very much about the idea of home, about documentation, about just what it means to write personally about a place that feels like we're losing that place every minute, all the time. And I was very pleasantly surprised and also moved to know that it hadn't felt alienating to them, because that's always a fear, I think, of writing um outwardly, if that makes sense. Like writing, speaking to a global audience, you necessarily are going to end up alienating a lot of local readers, because they're not going to need the context that you're giving to international readers. And so yeah, so I was just relieved to know that it didn't feel like a book where they were reading and they just thought, I know all of this already, you know, what is the point of it? And I was also glad that they saw it as something that was a tribute to home, which was it is a theme that I try to bring up a lot in the book. And the other kinds of conversations that were happening, I felt a little more just I sort of paid attention to some of it, but not necessarily. One of them was about Anglophone literature. So there were a couple of pieces that came out that was about the question of, you know, what it means to write in a post-colonial language. You know, is I think one of them basically just mentioned how I still couldn't really write my way out of the post-colonial burden of having to give so many caveats of like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm writing in English again. And, you know, it feels like burdened by it. And other people would be saying, oh, you know, like, I'm glad to see that it is a book that is published in a language that is quote unquote international, but at the same time feels true to their experiences. And so there was different opinions about that. And Anglophone literature in Hong Kong is just, this is like a never ending discussion topic. And I don't think we're really going to be able to have like satisfactory answers, because it isn't possible. But I'm glad that it opened up more conversations in that regard. At the same time, I also think that those conversations cannot be advanced unless we start creating actually more primary material, if that makes sense. So
Yeah.
as in we can write criticism about, you know, the few handful of English books that are published every couple of years all we want, and that does really help the conversation. But at the same time, for there to actually be an ecosystem of Hong Kong literature in English to be talked about, people have to write more literary text in English to begin with. And I don't know what the, you know, future of that looks like. I know the Hong Kong poetry scene in English has been getting stronger and stronger, from what I feel like, but through observing local new poets that whose work
Mm.
I've had my eye on. But otherwise, I'm not really sure. In terms of memoir / personal writing / essay writing, prose, there hasn't really been all that much to work with. And there's a lot of journalism, though. And then the third kind of conversation is this local / international, like false binary
Oh
divide,
yeah.
arbitrary line of, and I think, you know, that conversation is interesting because even though I'm really talking about international students, school students in that chapter, I think you can apply that conversation to also the distance that's felt sometimes with returning diaspora. You know, I've had friends who their parents moved away from Hong Kong when they were a kid, and they grew up outside of Hong Kong. And then in their 20s, they came back to Hong Kong to see, you know, like what to reconnect with their parents' birthplace, or, you know, to try and make a career, or try to write about and make art and so on. And they also feel a huge amount of distance just by the amount of politics and, you know, the language barriers that they would have to cross in order to feel like they truly understand the city, and know, and feeling like they don't belong to it as well. And I think that conversation about international school kids, a lot of it has to do with language, privilege, and class. And I think there is something about that, about how isolated and insular and inward looking that bubble is, that allows for a person to be able to live in a place and not engage with it, which is something that I feel I was a part of when I was younger. And it's interesting because I think the most sort of emotional letters or responses that I've received from people were actually people who um belong in this category, like they identify as part of the diaspora, or
Mm.
they were also an international school student and struggled to figure out what their place is in Hong Kong. I think some of them I know. So an international school teacher actually asked me to give a talk at his
Mm.
school when a book came out, and it was really interesting to speak to really young kids, as
Mm.
teenagers, but like, and when they read the book, they were sort of like worried about it because I think they felt like maybe I disliked them or felt like I was
Mm.
telling them off for like not knowing enough about the city. And it was just like, that's like not the point at all. The point of it is to tell you that it is possible to find belonging in the city. It's just you have to figure out what that way is for you, that makes sense to you, and that is going to feel comfortable for you. If
Mm.
you don't have to cross arbitrary hurdles that you set up for yourself, and think of this like, oh, belonging to Hong Kong as this huge thing you can never be part of. And I think once I was able to let go of that and understand what my own biases and ignorance was, it was much easier for me to figure out, okay, this is how I relate to the city that I grew up in, and this is what gives me a sense of belonging.
And you mentioned a little bit diaspora, and one thing that I want to ask you, I recently interviewed Nigerian writer Deepu Following, and we spoke about different Western media stereotypes about Africa and his views about Black diaspora. And he said something in relationship with the continent, and he said something so interesting. He pointed to the absence of what he said were realistic portraits of the region in the mainstream media, for this lack of understanding even between Africa and many Black diaspora communities, because they said he says they're trying to rebuild or even build connections with the continent and their lost heritages, but the mainstream representation is so not true to what is the reality. I want to hear about your the idea of diaspora and the fact that, like, at one point in the book, it was so fascinating when you say how when you were pitching to publications in your submissions guidelines that they say do not send ideas about people and events in Asia unless they convey something about the Asian diaspora that resonates with the Asian American experience.
Yeah, I think like this is a tricky topic because first of all, being in London right now, I get mistaken for Asian American as well, just because of this like vaguely neutral American leaning accent that I have. And I it's a tricky question because Asian Americans, there's been so much literature that came out in the past couple of years about, what does it even mean, like what is this group, like can we really lump a Japanese American, Korean American, Chinese American, who all grew up with very different experiences, into this mass lump of so-called identifying, group. And they also went through, a very specific kind of immigration experience that uh, is obviously not one that I went through at all. But at the same time, there are so many more resources that are dedicated to be able to help Asian American writers have more visibility, I think, these days. And a lot of the times when writers that I'm friends with and we would try to look for fellowship opportunities or try to look for, residency opportunities or magazine submissions and so on. And not many of them are, open to other members of Asian writers. And I understand, if it's an American publication, they want to focus on their own community and the people that they want to help. But at the same time, it's sort of like, how do we manage to find a way to set up our own space and, also be able to tell, quote unquote, Asia is such a huge concept, It's just, but how do we tell stories about our own country's homeland, city, and create those opportunities for ourselves? Like, that is a question, because we can't, it's impossible almost to band together, our Japanese writers writing in English and Korean writers writing in English. Like, actually there are times when we would find each other on Twitter, but it's so difficult to be able, because we're not physically in the same space, we operate in very different literary traditions. There really isn't something that cohere and bring all these people together. And so I'm just thinking about the fact that, publishing is very dominated by, America and the UK, but really America book market is something else altogether, right? And their publication writing is a very different literary space. And for those of us who are trying to find a way to have our stories told, but have no idea where our place is in those kind of spaces, or it was a very disorienting experience. And what you said just now about the gulf between, diaspora writers, or writers who are from certain African countries, like I think I've read about that in certain works by different Black writers as well, even just the specificity of also Black American experience with the rest of, the African diaspora experience. It's very, very different. And this is something that I ruminate on a lot. A lot of the times, when you leave a place for a long time, your imagination of the place, or the things that you are concerned about, or the sort of actual physical distance, also gives way to this psychological distance that makes it easier for you to theorize a place. And I always feel complicated about that, because theorizing it gives birth to interesting ideas about a place, but at the same time, for people who still live there, it feels so alienating. It feels like they aren't speaking to anything that we could recognize, because they're basing their theories off experiences that aren't even necessarily true, or that has not been true for many years. And so yeah, I think there have been more efforts to bring these people together so that we can recognize each other more. But as far as I know, there is always going to be that gap, or that psychological distance. And I don't really know if there's a way to solve that.
I'm nodding in a very, oh yeah, specifically about the idea of romanticizing a place that you left, and also feeling like you know so much about it, but then also questioning how much those notions are actually really true today. Another theme that is different than what we just spoke about, but very important in your book, is mental health.
Yeah.
And you share, and I want the listeners and the viewers to, read for themselves and engage with all the very genuine personal experiences that and intimate things that you've shared in the book. And you also share your observations and research about huge mental health crisis in Hong Kong and the wealth gap in the healthcare system. You write that the state of mental health in the city becomes a ticking time bomb, one that erupts into a full-blown crisis during a protest movement. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this idea of accumulated collective pain, or the consequences of an ongoing climate of fear.
Okay, I'll answer this question, but also I just want to quickly supplement a little about what you said just now, which is that, like, I think I always used to be this proponent of thinking, I think local productions really are the answer a lot of the time, because that is where you really get to see what the people on the ground are thinking and feeling. I've just been away for 5-6 months away from Hong Kong now, and I haven't been back at the time, and I really would not write anything about Hong Kong from afar, because when I just like when I was in Hong Kong, and I've been in Hong Kong all my life, it's very remarkable the kinds of different conversations that takes place in the online world, and also when you're actually at dinner or when you're at restaurants with your friends and listening to them speak. I've recognized that, and I think a lot of the times, because of the amount of online information that is so readily available, you think that by logging in onto forums all the time and looking at what local people are saying, or looking at Facebook, or reading news articles, you get the sense that you think you know what the atmosphere is. And I know for a fact that when I was there, like what was happening online and what was happening in real life, that it's a very different kind of conversation, just because people don't necessarily talk about their genuine fears and concerns when they're on social media. And so that's one thing. And then the second thing I want to talk about quickly is just that, local productions are very important. And that is something that Hong Kong is struggling with right now, because it's more and more difficult to be able to launch something and work around, this untouchable thing that is a national security law. And it makes it much more difficult to write, and makes it much more difficult to be able to talk about things openly, and also just resources, because I think a lot of the time people don't necessarily realize that, for the reason why certain books have not been written, or certain publications that have existed died out, is because people don't have the resources. We don't have the resources to keep sustaining something, and now it is potentially dangerous to take foreign money. So if there's a foreign organization that's funding something, it could also potentially spell danger for the people who founded those things. And and just simply, if you want to dedicate the time and resources to research a book, to have the space to write a book, if you don't have money, you can't do that. It's just, of course, there are people who make zines on the side, and they do it on top of their day jobs, but it is exceedingly difficult. And as someone who was pretty broke in my early 20s, I can say that I tried to do it, and it also was very massive burnout for me. And so by recognizing that, it's sort of like, these are the set of constraints, and how are we going to be able to do the most that we can to advance a conversation. Okay, circling. Okay,
No,
back
that's
to the
really important. Yeah, I know, because like and then there's that other point of not just local production, but that you wish that kind of local knowledge is launched to the world, and that it is read the way that it is produced from the context, rather than being necessarily framed for, was there a new book like A Grandpa in Texas or something?
yeah. Yeah, that is
Yeah.
but yeah, okay, with mental health, what I was thinking about was, because in 2019 there have been increasing conversations about just the toll that the protests were taking on everyone in the city. And of course, it's especially severe for protesters who were out on the front lines. It was also quite severe for reporters, but also just the general public, because you could really just go out and get tear gas on the street without any warning, just because of the widespread amount of protests, and then by reaction, of course, like police crackdown. And so that was a period that was pretty traumatic for a lot of people. And honestly, I even just thinking back to those days, like it still is, sometimes I look at something on the news and I'll just like scroll past it and be like, like for another day, like it's like I can't look at this right now. And what I was really trying to do with the essay that I wrote in the book is, all of those problems that I listed took place before 2019. So like my mental health so-called crisis, or whatever I want to, whatever we can frame it as, it started in around 2014 and 15. And most of it were not triggered by political reasons. They were triggered by personal reasons. And what I encountered when I was trying to get help through the public healthcare system was just this like series of pretty impossible hurdles. And I have actually heard similar discussions in the UK as well about, you know, like someone who isn't doing well psychologically, and it takes so many weeks just to get through to the NHS to be able to get an appointment. And it is the same, and it has been that way in Hong Kong for a long time. You know, nobody wants to be a psychiatrist. There's massive burnout. There's not enough psychiatrists, not enough people to see patients, and long waiting times. And some people can't afford private mental health care. And that's how, you know, you get this apparatus of impossible of dealing with mental health. And then you also get this culture where, you know, when I was growing up, it was just you can't talk about it publicly. People conflate it with, you know, you being crazy, or why are you taking medication, just stuff like that, which is a very, you know, backwards a sort of conversation. But when you have all of those things, and then you have 2019, it really becomes just all the ingredients you need for a mental health crisis. And that was sort of what was happening at the time. And I think this is a part that, you know, during difficult times politically, or during times of political crisis, people always would put more emphasis on mental health and talk about the repercussions of it. But afterwards, people tend to forget about it. But the thing with things like PTSD is, you know, it's not going to last for just that amount of time. It has very real and lasting consequences for the people. And if the system continues to be that way, then that is going to be an ongoing problem for Hong Kong society to deal with. And so I was just trying to discuss that and articulate that. But as far as I know, I have no idea. Like political changes aren't improving, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Just the political situation is not by any means improving. And I have no idea what
And that is why I wonder, while I was reading that also, that those themes of just lingering or accumulated pain when there is ongoing fear will just remain present, and they will just, regardless of any hypothetically improved public policy or investment, because you do mention that there were some, you know, announced at least improvements or investments in terms of that health part. But when you have that, when you have stifled freedoms, or when there is no space to even deal properly with what caused the PTSD, I feel it's really difficult to speak about any real improvement, right? Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Yeah, especially when, you know, trials are still happening over things that are happening in 2019 and 2020. You know, massive trial just opened a couple of days ago, and immediately I just like I'm not even physically in Hong Kong at the moment, and I just had a flashback to the morning when I woke up and it was announced that the police had arrested, you know, it was more than 47 people at the time, but then in the end it was 47. It's known as the case of, you know, the 47 people who ran for legislature for a primary election, but they've all been arrested and detained, and the trial just opened. And I just thought about that morning when I woke up and learned about that happening. And also just every single day when you look at the news, you see someone else is sent to jail for rioting. And you know, it's an ongoing for sure. And I think that's why, you know, before we began the conversation, you talked a little bit about, you know, how it feels like therapy sometimes. And I do feel like it sometimes feels like therapy when I get to talk to other people. Last week, I was at a conversation organized by a university where my friend was speaking at it. And he used to be a reporter from Hong Kong. Well, he's still a reporter, but he was working in Hong Kong at the time. And he was speaking with, you know, different journalists from working in different conflict areas, and also different areas of massive protests. And I had attended by Zoom a similar conversation organized last year, and both times it was just striking the similarities that everyone was talking about in terms of either safety, security, trauma. And at the end of the talk, one of them was saying like, oh, this just felt like group therapy. Like we just had like a public group therapy session. And I think that that's, yeah, it's it's uncanny.
Yeah, it's so comforting in a weird way because the source
Yeah.
of that transnational solidarity or understanding is so messed up
Yeah.
about what is being taken away um, from so many across the borders and despite the specificities, right?
Yeah, and also just that, the authoritarian playbook isn't especially innovative.
Right.
It's sort of replicated in similar models across the world, and so it's extremely natural that we're just going to all be experiencing certain levels of the same thing, just in a different form, or maybe with different cultural specificities and two different degrees of severity. But at the same time, it really is just the same problems a lot of the time.
And in one sentence, or like at one point in your book, you write how during the 2019 protests, you had written, quote, "We should all keep doing what we're doing and outlive the Communist Party. But now carrying on means that if you want to continue to speak or reach out or teach or write or protest, you have to brace yourself for jail or exile." End of quote. And of course, and we don't have to go into all those political drama and moments, and people should read your book, obviously, but that notion, how much time do we all have left? I don't know. Do you feel comfortable sharing anything about it? When you said, when you wrote in the book, I don't know if I'll ever leave, but I do know that I'm now less certain I'll be here forever.
Yeah, I think like when I said like how much time do we all have left? It's almost as if you're continuing to do what you're doing, and that point where you stop is either when you're being made to stop by the authorities, for instance, if you receive threats or if you get thrown in jail, or you just can't physically do it anymore. Your body is telling you like, you know what, stop, and you need to get out of this thing that you're doing, or you just like completely just have to extract yourself from the place entirely and go somewhere else. And that's sort of what I meant by when I say how much time do we have left, like how much longer are we going to be able to hold on to. And I have an immense respect for a lot of my friends who they started out as reporters around the same time as I did, and a significant amount of them are still in journalism, and they're still in doing this at the moment, and they're still in Hong Kong and they're still doing this. And that is just really, really, I don't want to say admirable because it almost feels like patronizing. It's just like I have so much respect for them. And personally for myself, like I think like, I came here in September for a master's program. And part of it was also, it had to do with a lot of personal things that were happening in my life at the time. But also just I was so tired. I have been in one place, like I'm 29, I'm turning 30 this year. And I have been in one place my entire life for like almost 3 decades. I have never lived anywhere else apart from those 4 months in Glasgow. And I was kind of thinking to myself, like, if I don't leave this place now, I am not, I like, even when it gets too painful to be here, I'm not going to have the confidence to ever think I'm going to be able to leave, just because I think when you get, the older you get, the harder it is for your body to really adjust to new things. And as much as I speak with this like vaguely international accent and can survive in other places, it really is a very different experience when you go to a new place altogether. And I just sort of saw it as like posing a challenge to myself and being like, okay, you know what, just try for a year and see what happens, and learn things, observe what things are like with this new wave of people from Hong Kong who immigrated over. I've been reading a lot of fiction and a lot of just craft books, and by the end of the year, I'll just see what happens. And I've always said that I would go back. I still think that I'm going to go back. There isn't really any reason for me not to. It's just how long this break is going to take. And it's not as if I don't follow what's happening in Hong Kong anymore, because I can't not follow it.
Right.
But having that little bit of distance was what I needed, I think, at the time. I was pretty it was, 2019 happened, and then it was 2020, the national security law and a pandemic started. And then I was like indoors, for a huge part for 2 years. And then the book came out, and then it was, a nonstop talking about Hong Kong as well, for a year. And at that point, I was just so exhausted. I think the first week I landed in London, I just like slept for a week. I
Mm,
was
mm.
crashing at a friend's place, and I was just walking, talking to his dog, and then sleeping the whole time because I just like could not do anything.
It's so amazing. And there's like a whole literature that I try to, because I'm also a nerd for that sort of psychology stuff, but even the idea of how we often get to think about the acts of self-compassion that are necessary for our mental health as sometimes selfish, or that we feel guilty about it, whereas that burnout, psychological and physical, is legitimate
Yeah.
thing. And there are really these mind-body connections and the suffering that transpires from this
Yeah.
sort of engagement in a battle for freedom. I don't want to sound like so battle for freedom or whatever it might be the context, right?
Yeah. The way I see it is like, nobody apart from yourself is going to know what the limits of your own
Mm,
physical and mental health is. And if just like at the point I was reaching last year, I was just thinking, if I let it break, I'm not going to be able to do anything anymore. It's just like if it gets to a point where I feel so overwhelmed that I'm like, you know what? F it. I'm just going to leave completely and immigrate and go to a different country and never think about any of this thing again. It's not going to be helpful in the long run. And it's not going to be helpful for me either. And I don't want to reach that point where I have to
mm,
feel like I have to completely just like, um, again, to use that word, just extract myself from that situation. And so part of it was just me thinking, okay, you know what? Like, take this time to sort of like rest and you recuperate or whatever it is. And you know it's resting in order to be able to walk more later. It's sort of like a saying, but yeah, like in order to be able to go longer distances, you have to first rest a little. And I also recognize that, first of all, one point that I just reached last year when I was living in like massive anxiety all the time for no particularly logical reason. It was just like when you see people continually being arrested, even if logically you know that you're not on, the
mm,
priority list, it doesn't matter. Your brain is still telling you like, oh, this is a possibility.
mhm.
And so like I was just reaching a point of like massive anxiety. And then I also just got to a point where I just realized guilt was not serving anything anymore. It had very little purpose, because I think when I was younger, guilt used to be able to be such a motivating factor for me to do more and then do more. And then now I just realized like I don't need guilt to drive
Mm,
me. I don't need to, make up for whatever. I have to do it because I believe in this thing and because I want to. And because, guilt ultimately it can be constructive, but it's very mentally destructive.
mhm.
And if you operate really coming from a place of guilt, I don't think that does a lot of people a lot of things. Even if you're writing about it, it doesn't. What does that serve? Like what are you encouraging in other people? And so yeah, I got to a point where I was just like, you know what, stop feeling sorry for yourself. Like there's a lot of people who like, and also, but what you said, be self-compassionate. If I do feel sorry for myself every now and then, and if I still feel guilty, I'm like, you know what, just embrace it. That's what you feel.
Yeah.
Do whatever you do, feel whatever you need to feel, and then just don't lose sight of the big picture in the meantime. Don't be don't grow apathetic about the situation. It just I think I am learning how to stay sane so that
Yeah.
I know how to do this for longer.
And it's an ongoing process, and it might be and require different things at different stages or points. So it's a constant training, I think, as well. And you mentioned how you read a lot of fiction lately, and I wanted to ask you, are you still Do you feel burnt out from writing this genre of personal political essays that, as you say, turn the camera lens towards yourself? How do you feel about it right now?
This is like a mildly like existential question
Oh,
that
yeah.
I think about like every day, because like part of I last year I was joking to a friend. I was like, I am just not gonna write like anything that's personal, like in that sense, the quote unquote personal essay genre for like 5 years or more or whatever, because I just like I got tired of it's very difficult sometimes as well to juggle the ethics of all of it. So recently I wrote a piece, and I think it just came out in the LA Review of Books, and it's for the quarterly issue. But I just like I wrote about a lot of my friends and just the love that they have given me and what it means to have a home in them. And so like before I submitted it and after I finished the draft, I sent it to every one of them that I mentioned in the book to make sure that they were okay with it.
Mm.
And also when I wrote the Impossible City, everyone save certain people in my family, everyone who was interviewed for the piece, for the book, I sent them back just the passages that involved them, just because I wanted them to make sure, sometimes when you're interviewed, you say things that aren't necessarily the way you mean it. This is not a book where I have to challenge you as a politician. I'm not trying to catch you or anything. I want you to be able to say exactly what you think about things. And so I would send it back to them and make sure they're okay with it, especially, with such these big topics that they're sharing about, can be really fraught with different kinds of sensitivities. And and you know I'm still trying to figure out what are the ethics at all of writing. Like yeah,
Hey, you're
that
not going to figure out. You're going to be asking yourself and doing it all the time.
because like I've been trying to figure that out in
Yeah.
class. And I think my tutor for a bit was just constantly just trying to tell me, liberate yourself, build a fictional framework so you can talk about these very true emotional things without compromising the quality of it. And you don't have to tiptoe around it all the time because you're worried about who you're insulting or who, is going to feel bad about it. But I still find it really difficult. Like I feel like, people who read it are going to know that it's them that I wrote about, right? And I'm not good enough of a writer to be able to completely invent things from nothing. And so so just trying to write fiction, that's one of the things I'm trying to come up with is how do I write about these things in a way that aren't going to hurt anyone around me, but at the same time I was a journalist for a long time, and now being here, I'm trying to approach writing as a quote unquote craft or art. And when it gets to that point, I just always feel like,
Are
oh my
you
God, what is
saying nonfiction writing is not an art?
no, that's not the thing. But it's like
I'm kidding. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
but you know what I mean?
It's
It's like, oh
different
my
sort
God,
of edits for
making art.
sure. Oh,
It's
yeah.
what is making art is so
Yeah.
fuzzy and so like not
Yeah.
satisfying sometimes, because like it's so easy to make bad art that doesn't do anything, that has no purpose. They don't need to exist in the world sometimes. And with something that's like grounded in journalism, grounded in facts, grounded in history, I know that even if my writing is complete crap, like the book would serve a certain kind of purpose because there are archival material, there are resources, there are links and so on, and I know that it has a utilitarian purpose for existence in the world. Making art, I genuinely don't know if there's like a purpose, and so sometimes I'm just like, what am I doing? Like I I'm not really sure, but yeah,
Yes.
continuing to exploit myself has not stopped. It remains my favorite hobby.
I wonder, because this process of self-examination continues until many do end up finding, I'm not going to say peace because that sounds cheesy, but they end up feeling liberated, as your professor saying, in whatever way they do. So it's kind of, I'm almost feeling like, Karen, let's meet for a coffee in a couple of months and see where you're at then, where you're going to tell me, give me your advice, give me a good practice about this. It's both individual, but then also there is something to practices, so to speak, or research that can be so useful for people who might feel this way. So that's why I feel that all this conversation, I can't believe almost an hour passed and we're approaching the end, felt so real and felt so hopefully beneficial to many others who would listen it too. And as we come to the end, the title is Wider Angle, and I ask each one of my guests about their thoughts on the wider angle of their work or the story, depending on what it is. So I'm curious to hear, there's one thing that after the end of your book that, there were many themes, like you say, and I learned so much, but one thing particularly stuck with me, and that is how you said, and you wrote, we say, remember to archive, remember to remember. And that feels like something I want to put on my wall and see. It's so powerful. But tell me about what it meant for you as kind of the driving motive, or one of the driving motives to write this whole book.
Yeah. So for 4 years before I came to London, I worked at an art archive. So it was like a contemporary art archive, collecting information, documents about art galleries, artists in Asia that might have been overlooked in this capital art history. And I think that is part of where this impulse of archiving comes from, but it also comes from watching a lot of these newspapers in Hong Kong disappear after the national security law crackdown, and just being terrified of what I actually, it got to a point, I was lucky to have written my book and the time that I did, because if you look at the bibliography, if you look at the footnotes, and there are a lot of links in there, I think half of the links maybe don't work anymore because Stand News and Apple Daily both closed down. And I had linked, I think, at least a couple of things from Stand News. And it actually did get to a point where last year when I was writing a separate piece, I was trying to find all the information that I was referring to, when you want to know specific dates about things that were happening, right? I was trying to find it. And at the time, so people actually have made archives of those newspaper that have disappeared since, but it's much more difficult to find them before, because the links that you had saved, they're all dead. And I found it so difficult just to try to figure out what date was it that this thing happened. And, I am someone who is by nature terrified of forgetting things. Like, it comes to just every aspect of my everyday life. Like, I am very troubled when, I've said something and I don't remember having said something, or something had happened and I have a very fuzzy memory of it. So I think that's part of why I'm such a, I'm not a very good journal
Keeper.
Yeah, but I take a lot of notes, and a lot of these notes eventually manifest in some form or another in a piece of writing. But I just have to take these notes over and over again all the time, because I'm obsessed with knowing what happened on that day. And to think about this forgetting on a widespread level, on a societal level, is terrifying to me. But I also would have to say, okay, so the impetus of writing the book has to do with that, right? Like, it has to do with me wanting to say, okay, these are 30 years of my life that I am writing about right now. Nobody can take that away from me now, because it's there, it's published, it has a tangible existence in the world that is not just in my head. I can say that these things happened, but at the same time, I want to be able to tell everybody, it's not the end, if that makes sense. Like, I don't want the takeaway of what happened to be pure pessimism. Even looking around Hong Kong now, you can see there's so many people who are still, starting new organizations or documenting court reporting, and new media outlets. There are varying degrees of good or bad in terms of their level of reporting, but they're still doing things. There are so many people who are still doing things, and I don't want I don't want that to be just like a period, like a full stop of like, okay, like 2020 Hong Kong, that's it. We don't have to think about it anymore. If anything, it's even more important to think about how are we going to be able to preserve in the coming years with these challenges in place. So yeah, so that's the thing that
TBC, to be
yeah,
continued.
yeah, exactly.
Oh, this was so wonderful. I really am. I'm very grateful for that this ended up happening. And thank you so much, Karen Cheung, the author of Hong Kong, the Impossible City. Hope to stay in touch, and thank you for joining Wider
This
Angle.
was so fun. Yeah. Let's keep emailing.
Let's keep emailing and sharing the best practices.
Yeah.
To everybody else in the audience, stay tuned for more conversations with people from all over the globe. Have a good day. Bye.